Recently released documents obtained from a whistleblower by Republican Senators Chuck Grassley and Josh Hawley demonstrate the danger posed by the paused, but by no means abolished, DGB, Disinformation Governance Board, and the regime behind it. The documents show the intent of the deep state to deputize big tech on its behalf as America's unofficial domestic speech police, violating the First Amendment by proxy. The documents also illustrate the duplicity of those who claim the DGB was just another government task force with little power or ambition, raising questions about what else our national security apparatus is doing in pursuit of its war on wrongthink. Now, when the American people first found out about the DGB and grew outraged over the fact the Biden administration had created a Ministry of Truth and put a serial spewer of disinformation in charge of it, it strained to suggest the DGB would combat disinformation threatening the homeland from foreign actors, notwithstanding the DGB was housed in the domestic security apparatus. It claimed to target rumors being spread by foreign traffickers supposedly lying about America's open borders or Russian disinformation propagated on the heels of the coming midterm elections. But the planning documents now revealed for the DGB tell an entirely different story. In a memo to DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas titled Organizing DHS Efforts to Counter Disinformation, DHS officials wrote that disinformation threatens Homeland Security beginning with two types of it. Quote-unquote, conspiracy theories about the validity and security of elections, and disinformation related to the origins and effects of COVID-19 vaccines or the efficacy of masks. The drafters said they were concerned that domestic violent extremists would amplify phony narratives based on this disinformation to drive, quote, racially or ethnically motivated and anti-government, anti-authority violence. So in the memo, they called for DHS to respond to disinformation in areas where there are clear objective facts, quoting here, i.e. medical evidence regarding COVID, factual information about elections administration and security. In other words, clearly, this DHS counter-disinformation effort was developed with the intent to combat dissenting domestic views from the regime's favored ones on the kinds of highly contentious and consequential issues demanding public debate, and on which our authorities have persistently spread official narratives that have proven false, misleading, or incomplete. The document recommended several models for countering disinformation, including creating a DGB, its primary recommendation, which DHS Secretary Mayorkas would, of course, accept. The memo parallels DHS's National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin from February 22, an infamous one, months after the memo was produced, but before DHS announced the creation of the DGB, as well as prior threat bulletins, suggesting that among the greatest contributors to America's heightened threat environment was an online environment filled with mis, dis, and malinformation, MDM, including on COVID-19 and election integrity. The memo also flows naturally from the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which we've discussed before, which too focuses on combating dangerous conspiracy theories and disinformation and misinformation that undermine faith in government. Now, that strategy also called for the feds to collaborate with, among others, technology companies to address terrorist content online and counter terrorist abuse of internet-based communications platforms to recruit others to engage in violence. Efforts that become infinitely more chilling when dissent from regime orthodoxy is treated as equivalent to terrorist danger. The DGB serves the exact kind of role contemplated by the strategy. Its charter, released in the Grassley-Hawley document trove, calls for the board to support and coordinate MDM work with other department agencies, the private sector, and non-governmental actors. Among them, it seems, big tech. Notes prepared in advance of a meeting between DHS officials and several Twitter executives, seemingly planned for April 22, show that DHS planned to, quote-unquote, discuss operationalizing public-private partnerships between DHS and Twitter, and also talked about ways the department could be helpful to Twitter's counter-MDM efforts. During the meeting, DHS officials contemplated informing Twitter executives about DHS work on MDM, including the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board and its analytic exchange and the department's ongoing DVE, domestic violent extremism, work. The notes indicate DHS was also planning to brief Twitter on the heightened threat environment, channeling the February 22 threat bulletin, driven in part by the proliferation of false or misleading narratives which sow discord or undermine public trust in U.S. government institutions. According to Senators Grassley and Hawley, Internal DHS memoranda also show that DHS believes that by sharing information, DHS can empower, and I'm quoting directly here, partners to mitigate threats such as providing information to technology companies, enabling them to remove content at their discretion, so they say, and consistent with their terms of service. The notion that the DGB would be coordinating with social media companies on dis, and malinformation, with DHS believing this could influence their content moderation policies, but then that it would expect platforms to operate completely independently and of their own volition, well, that simply doesn't pass the smell test here. It's particularly unbelievable when one considers that for months, Biden administration officials, from the president to his press secretary, surgeon general, and now even his climate czar, had and have been calling for, indicating that they already have been pressing big tech to censor wrongthink and wrong thinkers. The desire to harness this power of big tech might explain in part why members of the deep state are so hostile to seeing its biggest players broken up. In any event, it's clear these whistleblower documents belie the notion that the DGB was not operational, just as they belie the idea it would solely be externally focused. And given Secretary Mayorkas' deception on these matters, as well as on basic ones about things like when the board was established, and the fact that another document in the trove seems to be draft legislation sponsored by DHS that would have created a rumor control program to counter MDM, the seeming duplicity and disturbing ambition can only lead one to wonder, what else is DHS up to in its pursuit of a broader domestic counterterrorism effort that has put even concerned parents in the deep state's crosshairs? The Biden administration has indicated that despite the pause, but not cancellation of the DGB, that DHS is still going to continue the DGB's work. Those aghast at the weaponization of the regime against its critics must demand every dimension of the war on wrongthink be wholly exposed, as Senators Grassley and Hawley have started to do, and taken apart root and branch. Killing an as yet undead DGB is necessary, but it's a wholly insufficient remedy for overcoming the cancer that is our regime's jihad against dissent.